Previously on Weird Planet. That settles it, Cap. We've just about got 1 chance in 100 of making that crash landing on Zilda, but 999 chances of being torn apart by the gravitational pull in the rim. I don't like it here. It gives me the creeps. It looks too good to be real here. I've a nasty feeling that any moment the whole setup may turn into a nightmare. You're dead right about nightmares, Cap. We're in the middle of one right now. There's only 1 chance to get airborne again. We'll have to patch up the leaking fuel tanks and try to make the moon. By tomorrow, she will be nearer to Zilda than any other time this month. Bleak, barren and icy as were the craters of the moon, the terrestrians knew it would at least be free from this sinister vegetation, whose invisible menace surrounded them in the treacherous jungle. I remember something I learned on the University of Mars when graduating for my science degree, Marcus Vane, the scientist, suddenly remarked, his blue-skinned Venusian face alight with excitement. That Thor Thorson, who was exiled here after his unsuccessful rebellion against the Jovian dominions, was an expert transmuter of the old school and had discovered how to disintegrate molecular energy and transmute it into a different shape altogether. I heard that tale too, Clint Carter joined in excitedly. Why, that was how he succeeded in staging his rebellion against the 5 planets, with milliards of robot automatons reintegrated with vegetable molecules and animated by dynamo hypnotension. The other 9 shuddered uneasily. They had all seen on the old teleoscopathic newsreels of the Great Rebellion, when block after block of turnip-faced, celery-limbed Vegematons marched blindly into the jaws of the giant disintegrators outside the marble walls of the Jihur, the capital of Mars. Armed with alpha ray guns, these weird vegetable simulacrums had been motivated by their creator, Thor Thorson, himself an ashen-faced interplanetary crossbreed of blue Venusian mixed with ruby-eyed Jovinian. Finally, after thousands of Terrestrians and swarthy Martians in platinum armour had died in the battle, Mercury Montalban, a scientist from the colonies of the outer galaxy, had found a way to defeat Thor's robot army of vegetable warriors. His plutonium blaster had succeeded where milliards of heroic warriors from the 5 planets had failed, by transmuting the molecules of Thor Thorson's robots into vapour, and Thor himself had been captured, disguised as an outlander, hiding in the swampy planet Neptune, a milliard kilos beyond the outer galactic belt. Exiled to Zilda 10 years before, Thor had presumed to have died some 8 years after. But could they be certain that he really had died? The 10 explorers wondered uncomfortably. These plants, Ludo muttered grimly, suddenly, as they huddled round their ship in the dusk of the sub-zero temperature of the rim. Maybe Thorson is still alive and fixed them to scare away unwelcome visitors. Gosh, Quain exclaimed, his lean bronzed face alight with excitement. You've hit the nail on the head there, Ludo. It sure does look like Thorson's still very much alive and is probably planning to stage a comeback. Thorson, they knew all too well, was a past master at the art of molecular motivation and transmutation of substances. Even without the assistance of his laboratory and equipment, it was likely his brilliant, if twisted, brain had been able to improvise the necessary equipment to motivate the plants on Zilda, even if not fully able to transmute the vegetable into humanoid organism. At any rate, one thing, luckily, is essential for both animal and vegetable organisms, Marcus Vane interrupted optimistically, scanning the drooping trees and plants outside the fiery circle, fencing the space explorers from attack. And that is sleep. I don't see our nasty little neighbours launching an attack till morning. For the 10-foot-tall blooms with purple-spotted spade-like leaves and flesh-tinted petals were folded up like furled umbrellas in sleep, and looked as innocently harmless as hollyhocks, arums and dahlias, the old-fashioned terrestrian flowers, still to be found in cottage gardens in the wilds of Brittany or the Outer Hebrides. Best take advantage of the lull to see how we can patch up the fuel tanks. As he spoke, Clint Carter was watching warily the dark outline just beyond the flickering circle of fire where the jungle began and safety ended. Suddenly he tensed, and his hand sought his plutonium blaster, a small but deadly weapon, no longer than a cigarette, that could kill or disintegrate an enemy at a distance of 100 feet. "Are you going to fight a woman?" The voice of the shadowy figure emerging from the shadows beyond the fire was silken with mockery. "I never knew that the dwellers of the 5 planets were so inhospitable before." "Great horned Diacolitedans!" gasped Vane, astounded. "It's a woman, and a Venusian one at that!" The girl, wearing a skin-tight costume of nylon acetate that revealed her alluring curves, was blue-skinned and purple-haired, as were all the inhabitants of the colony of Venus, closest of the outlands to the 5 planets. How she ever got to Zilda, milliards of kilos from her native planet of Venus, was a mystery. Stepping through the circle of dwindling flames as casually as if these were raindrops, the girl, her purple eyes and shimmering curls glowing in the firelight, smiled mockingly at the astounded explorers. "Do not be afraid of the flowers," she reassured them, "for they will sleep now till morning, when he awakens them to guard the planet." Her voice was reverent when speaking of he, as if she was some priestess in the temple of Mars or Jove, those gods whose worship dominated their namesake planets. "What is your name, and where do you come from?" Quain asked curiously, as the girl seated herself coolly in their circle. "We always heard that Zilda was uninhabited." "It was until 6 moons ago," the girl explained, "when our spaceship crashed on Zilda during my father's voyage to Xenia to collect Euvonium." They started as they recalled the top headline news of the missing prospector from Venus, Vuliar Wassel, whose spaceship had been lost in the rim while on a trip to locate Euvonium, that priceless essential of rejuvenation found only on Xenia, the moon of Zilda. "So you're Lunara Wassel, the professor's daughter," Carter interrupted eagerly. "I read you accompanied him on his journey." She nodded. "Yes, my father had trained me as his assistant. I went everywhere with him." They remembered how the professor, one of the most skilled rejuvenators of the outland planet of Venus, depended on his supplies of Euvonium, a vital metal found only on Xenia, for his all-important work. "We all heard that your spaceship had been disintegrated by the asteroids on the rim," Carter added. "No message was received at headquarters on the telecom, so naturally no search parties were sent out to investigate your disappearance outside the galaxy, Miss Wessel." "My father was killed by the plants soon after our crash," the girl continued, with a shudder of horror at the memory of that fateful accident of 6 months ago. "And the same fate would have been mine, only he saved me just in time." "Who is this he you are speaking about?" Quain asked, unable to stay his curiosity. "And how is it that he has not shown up yet? He must have heard your arrival earlier on." The girl from Venus shivered slightly. "He does not manifest himself, except to those he has chosen for his own," she whispered, glancing fearfully over her shoulder as she spoke. "And for those who he has not chosen, there is only one end." Her gesture in the direction of the silent but ever-rustling jungle behind their thin protection flames was all too suggestive of the horror that had befallen her father only 6 months ago. "Modern Terrestrians are going to prove a much tougher proposition than your father, Miss Wassel," Casimir Quain assured her cheerfully. "And if they do succeed in eating us, I'll lay 10 to 1 we'll give those nasty bits of vegetable matter the worst indigestion in the galaxy." The girl shuddered, continuing her story, while in the background, illuminated by the flames from their fire circle, the 2 mechanics, Tangrid Lang and Nemo Smith, tried to patch up the fuel tanks. "When my father was killed by those horrors, I panicked and ran away, trying to find help to save him. I saw a cave which looked as if it had been inhabited, and a man standing in the entrance watching the plants at their ghastly meal." She stopped, choked, and then made an effort to continue, her lovely face cold. "He was a queer-looking human, with a head like a bird, bald, and with a bony-beaked nose and deep-set eyes. He did not make the slightest attempt to prevent the plants, though he was armed with an atomic vaporizer and could quite easily have done so, but he seemed to be enjoying the sight." Lunara Wassel sobbed quietly, then continued tonelessly. "I begged him to save my father, but he refused. In my rage and desperation, I tried to tear the vaporizer from his hands. He suddenly became angry, pointed the vaporizer at me, and gave me a minimum shot, sufficient to stun and temporarily paralyze, but not to kill me. When I regained consciousness, it was all over. My father had vanished, and I was lying bound hand and foot in the cave, home of Thor Thorson, the cleverest devil the galaxy had ever spawned. Casimir Quain interrupted excitedly. I might have guessed as much. A cunning fiend like Thorson would be able, if he succeeded in smuggling the tools into exile with him, to create his plant robots on Zilda just as easily as he had created them before his arrest and banishment. The girl shook her head. He did not need to smuggle out any tools to animate the plants on Zilda, she assured them. He had only to inject them with raw uvonium, the greatest natural motivator in the galaxy. Yes, Clint Carter sounded incredulous. But where did he get the uvonium? I thought that only existed on Xenia, the moon of Zilda, and without a space rocket, how was he going to get there? Lunara Wassel explained at once. He didn't need to. You see, the moon was torn out of Zilda's flank during a meteoric collision in 1960, and the whole crater from which the moon was wrenched was full of uvonium deposits. It is in this crater that Thorson lives. He tunnelled into the rock with his vaporizer. How did you manage to escape from Thorson? How come he didn't feed you to his flowers like the professor? Quain asked curiously, his lean face taut and grim. He intended me to be his mate, to breed a new race of superhumanoids with plants for slaves, the girl replied simply, her trembling lips betraying the strain and tension she had undergone these last few months. But I doped him and managed to keep out of his way. Besides, he is too busy building up his army of plants to invade the inner galaxy and reconquer Terrace. How is it that our televisors never located him, or the telecom pick up his sound waves? Lunara responded at once. Because Thorson's burrowed deep into the crater walls and is out of range of both telecom and televisors. He succeeded in making a protective anti-radio barrier from instruments taken from our ship. It's hopeless trying to repair the fuel tank cap, Nemo Smith interjected gloomily, joining the huddled group by the dying flames. We're not likely to be needing them. The fuel's all gone. Lunara Wassel interrupted hastily. Oh, but you won't need fuel at all. The lake in the crater is radioactive, and every bit as effective for fuel purposes. That's right, Cap, Nemo interjected excitingly. If we could lay hold of some of that, it would be fine as a substitute fuel. Not so fast or smooth running, but good enough to get us back home safely. I'll show you the lake as soon as it's daylight, Captain Quain, Lunara promised eagerly, if you promise to take me with you back to Terrace. I've an aunt who will be glad for me to live with her now that poor father is gone. It's a deal, Miss Wassel, Quain told her as they extinguished the fire and prepared to make for the crater. But hadn't you best stay behind in the ship in case there's trouble and the plants attack us? You give directions and we'll carry out operation. Suddenly, before she could answer, there was a muffled shout from Ludo, the cook. He had gone to the tail of the Articus to get his blaster from the store, and something apparently had gone wrong. Great grief, explained Clint Carter in horror-stricken tones, pointing towards Ludo. They all stood petrified in horror as they saw Ludo, his face twisted in agony, being slowly but surely suffocated by a plant whose arm-thick branches encircled his writhing body, while the liver-coloured petals licked his face caressingly. "Help! For God's sake, shoot this thing!" screamed the man, fighting in its suffocating embrace. As one, the others wrenched their blasters from their harness and poured a stream of destructive atoms into the sickly, greenish-blotched trunk of the weaving plant. Purplish sap streamed from the stem and tendrils, leaves fluttered, twisting to the ground. A thin whining sound came from the victim, which, however, mortally wounded as it was, still continued to clutch at its victim convulsively and to fumble for his throat with its petals. "It can't be killed!" shrieked Ludo, tearing desperately at the octopus tentacles and ducking to avoid the evil bloated head, bent affectionately over him in awful mockery. His voice was muffled into an unintelligible choking gasp as the huge flower chalice engulfed his head like a cap, and when the petals opened and the tendrils uncurled like fingers, there was nothing left of the being who was Ludo Lorenzo. Next time on Weird Planet.